He dangled in silence beneath the rotting beams of an abandoned wooden bridge, frost clinging to his sable-black fur, paws twitching, breath shallow. Around his neck, a collar etched with a symbol no one could explain. No handler in sight, no unit. Just 30 feet of air below him and the weight of memories above. They thought he was astray. They thought wrong. What followed was a rescue that unearthed secrets buried in war, reunited broken brothers, and gave a girl named Sophie a second father in the form of a soldier too wounded to love again. But this isn't just a story about a dog hanging from a bridge. It's about the scars we hide, the bridges we burn, and the ones we dare to rebuild. Stay with us, tap the like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next tale that just might stitch something back together inside you. Red Creek, Oregon, a small mountain town cradled by whispering pines and the long winding silence of the Cascade foothills. It was mid-January, and the cold had settled deep into the bones of the land. Snow clung to rooftops like tired memories, and the sun, faint and pale, hung low behind a scrim of clouds, offering little warmth. The wind howled through the valley in slow, ghostly pulses, raking through bare branches like fingers through old piano keys. Eli Warren tightened the collar of his flannel-lined jacket as he stepped out of his truck, boots crunching over ice-packed dirt. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a dusting of early gray in his beard, Eli looked like someone shaped by both mountain winters and internal storms. His face, weather-worn and shadowed with quiet grief, bore the weight of a man who had once known fire and lost its warmth. 2 years ago, Eli had been a combat medic. 6 months ago, he buried his wife after a drunk driver took her life on Highway 4. Now, he spent his days trying to hold together what little remained, mainly for Sophie, his 8-year-old daughter. She was all curls and questions, and he was doing everything he could not to let his sorrow bleed into her world. That afternoon, Eli had been on his way to pick Sophie up from school when he caught a glint of movement near the old Red Creek Bridge, a once-used logging passage now reduced to moss-covered beams and sagging timber struts. Something about the stillness beneath it was wrong. The snow there hadn't been disturbed, and yet the air seemed taut. He parked near the tree line, engine off, and walked closer through the silence. Then he saw it. Hanging 20 feet below the bridge, swinging gently above the frozen creek, was a large German shepherd, limbs trembling, breath fogging the air in faint plumes. The dog's body was suspended by a harness-like collar that had snagged on a broken crossbeam. It wasn't a random rope, it was military grade. And around the animal's neck, a thick leather collar stamped with a metal emblem, an etched triangle intersected by 3 slashes. Eli felt his breath catch. That wasn't just any dog. Ranger, he whispered. Ranger was Red Creek's K-9 hero. The dog had been part of a retired explosives unit once assigned to patrol convoys in Afghanistan. Loyal, highly trained, and nearly impossible to scare. He'd returned with Sergeant Seth Foster, now Red Creek's sheriff, and had helped locate 2 missing kids in a blizzard the winter prior. Ranger wasn't just known, he was revered. But now he hung alone, limbs twitching from cold and exhaustion, a faint whimper barely audible beneath the groan of the bridge. Eli's instincts kicked in. He moved fast, scanning the area for anyone else. No tracks, no vehicles. Ranger had either been abandoned or left behind. Neither option sat well with him. He pulled his multi-tool from his pocket and began fashioning a makeshift pulley system using the rope in the back of his truck. Every few seconds, he glanced toward the dog, whose eyes remained locked on him, pleading, trusting. "Hold on, buddy," he murmured. "I got you." As he secured the rope to a nearby pine and tested the anchor, a small voice interrupted the silence behind him. "Dad?" He turned sharply. Standing a few feet away in her purple coat and pink snow boots, curly brown hair peeking from her wool hat, was Sophie Warren, 8 years old, her cheeks flushed red from the cold. Her eyes wide and bright like her mother's, were staring directly at the scene beneath the bridge. Sophie wasn't supposed to be there yet. Eli had asked his neighbor Margaret to pick her up, but clearly Sophie had insisted on walking, independent, headstrong, just like her mother. He rushed over, kneeling to block her view, placing his gloved hands gently on her shoulders. "Sophie, go back to the cabin, now." "But that's Ranger! Is he gonna fall?" Her lip trembled. "No," Eli said softly. "I won't let that happen. Please, sweetheart, go home and wait for me. This isn't safe." She hesitated, then nodded and turned. Her boots crunched quickly across the snow as she disappeared back into the trees. Eli exhaled, heart pounding. He returned to the bridge, clipped into his harness, and slowly began lowering himself down. The rope creaked, but held. As he descended, Ranger whined weakly, more sound than before. That was good. Still fighting. 10 feet, 6, 3. When they were eye level, Eli took in the dog's condition. Blood matted one of his paws. Frostbite darkened the edges of his ears. His muscles twitched, and his eyes were dull but alert. The collar had bitten deep into his fur. It was going to leave a scar. "I'm here," Eli said. "Let's get you out." He unhooked the snagged harness from the beam, clipped Ranger to his chest rig, and began the agonizing climb back. The added weight slowed him, but he didn't stop. Not once. Minutes later, he rolled over the edge, both man and dog collapsing into the snow. Ranger didn't move. His body was limp, breathing shallow. Eli wrapped his jacket around the dog and cradled him close. "Hang on, buddy," he murmured. "You're not dying here. Not like this." The wind howled louder, and the snow began to fall in slow spirals. But Eli didn't move. He held on to Ranger as if the act alone could anchor both of them. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was Margaret. She'd found Sophie walking alone on the trail and brought her safely home. Eli closed his eyes briefly in relief. One weight lifted. Now only one remained, and it weighed heavier than ever. By the time Eli Warren guided his battered truck through the snow-clogged streets of Red Creek and into the gravel drive of the veterinary clinic, the daylight had nearly faded into a soft blue dusk. The heater coughed warm air, doing little against the deepening cold. On the passenger seat, bundled in an army surplus blanket and barely conscious, lay Ranger, the dog whose fall from the bridge had shaken more than just the icicles loose from Eli's past. The Red Creek Veterinary and Livestock Clinic sat at the edge of town, a squat log-sided building nestled beside an aging barn and flanked by tall firs that whispered in the wind. A faded wooden sign above the door bore the carved image of a German shepherd and a mare surrounded by wildflowers. Eli scooped Ranger up with practiced gentleness. The dog's weight pressed heavily against his arms, unmoving except for the weak rise and fall of his chest. Blood from his injured paw had soaked through the blanket, staining Eli's jacket with warmth that did not comfort. He shouldered through the front door, triggering the soft jingle of the bell above it. Behind the reception counter stood Dr. Claire Mitchell, the clinic's lead veterinarian. Claire was in her late 30s, tall and willowy, with shoulder-length chestnut hair always tied back in a functional bun. Her face bore soft, angular features made striking by tired hazel eyes rimmed with perpetual shadow, a look earned not by makeup but long nights in grief she rarely spoke of. Once a rising star in an animal trauma unit near Portland, she'd returned to Red Creek after losing her younger brother in a military accident overseas. Since then, she moved with the quiet deliberation of someone who had learned that life, no matter how careful, could shatter in an instant. "Back room," she said quickly, rounding the desk the moment she saw Eli. Her gaze had already taken in the blood, the tremors, the collar. They moved to a sterile exam room with bright overhead lights and white tile counters lined with stainless instruments. Eli laid Ranger gently onto the padded table. Claire bent over the dog immediately, her hands deft and calm as she checked vital signs, lifted eyelids, examined limbs. "This collar," she muttered, brow furrowing as she studied the thick leather band. "This isn't standard canine issue." Eli stepped closer, voice low. "You see the engraving?" Claire leaned in, the triangle with 3 slashes etched into metal. Faint, but deliberate. She glanced at him, a flicker of something unease or recognition in her gaze. "I've only seen this symbol once before. Fort Gardner, the canine testing unit. Closed years ago." Eli's jaw tightened. "That was classified." Claire raised an eyebrow. "So was a lot of what you and Seth were involved in." He didn't answer. Ranger whimpered softly. Claire focused again on the dog, attaching fluids, applying ointment to cracked pads, stitching the torn paw. Eli watched in silence, jaw clenched, memories clawing at the back of his mind, memories of sand, steel, and orders that left more scars than bullets. "Will he make it?" he asked finally. Claire nodded slowly. "If the infection doesn't spread, and if he wants to." There was a pause. Eli glanced down at the collar again. "He was left there, Claire. Hung from a bridge. That's not an accident." She didn't ask who he thought would do such a thing. She knew Eli well enough to know his silence meant the answer was already boiling behind his eyes. I'll keep him overnight, she said gently. Come back in the morning. He looked like he might argue, but nodded instead and turned to leave. As he stepped into the cold again, snow began to fall, soft and soundless, like dust settling on forgotten bones. Back at the cabin, the lights inside glowed dimly against the white gloom. Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch, her favorite stuffed bear tucked under her arm, a book still open beside her. Eli quietly stoked the fire before kneeling beside her to pull a blanket over her small frame. As he reached for the book, something slipped free from between the pages. A worn leather notebook, edges frayed and spine cracked. It was her mother's journal. He paused. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted it. Emily Warren, his late wife, had always kept journals, small leather-bound volumes she never intended to be published. Just her thoughts, her fears, her observations about the world and the people she loved. Eli had never brought himself to read them after her death. Sophie had. He turned the page. In Emily's handwriting, looping and neat, was a letter never sent. If you're reading this, Eli, I hope it's because you finally let yourself stop running from everything. You always said some things were too broken to fix. But I've learned that even fractured glass can reflect light again if you're willing to see through it. Another line below in softer ink. Forgiveness isn't for them, it's for you. He closed the journal gently, jaw clenched. His hands gripped the worn leather like it could anchor him to something other than his own guilt. The fire popped softly behind him. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning brought blue skies and a cold wind. Eli returned to the clinic just after sunrise. Claire met him at the door, still in her scrubs, a fresh mug of coffee in hand. He's stable, she said simply, but still not moving much. You should see this. She led him back to Ranger's room. The dog lay quietly, eyes half open. Beside him on the counter sat the collar. Claire had cleaned it, revealing not just the triangle symbol, but a number carved faintly along the inner rim. 407K. I ran it through old vet records I had access to, she said. This wasn't just a military dog, he was part of a behavioral study, one involving trauma conditioning. Eli's stomach turned. They tried to break them, he said hoarsely. Claire didn't confirm, but her silence spoke enough. You think Seth knew? She asked after a moment. Eli didn't answer, but his fists were already curling. The snow had melted slightly overnight, leaving a slush that reflected the pale Oregon sun like scattered mirrors across Red Creek's cracked sidewalks. Eli Warren's boots struck the pavement with steady weight as he crossed Main Street toward the sheriff's department, his eyes locked on the faded green brick building ahead. The collar still sat heavy in his coat pocket, leather chilled, the symbol still etched in steel like a scar refusing to fade. Inside, the scent of burnt coffee and paper filled the cramped lobby. A desk fan hummed quietly, though it served no purpose in the winter. Behind the counter sat Deputy Paul Jensen, a lean man in his 40s with tired blue eyes and a clipped mustache, shoulders perpetually hunched like he was always waiting for bad news. He looked up from his paperwork as Eli entered, blinking twice before speaking. Seth's in his office. Eli didn't wait for permission. He pushed past, each step louder than the last. Sheriff Seth Foster was leaning over a cluttered desk, examining a map pinned with push points and faded red ink. A bulky man in his early 40s, Seth had a shaved head and square jaw. His olive-toned skin stretched tightly across cheekbones hardened by the sun and time. His uniform looked freshly pressed, though his eyes were rimmed with sleeplessness and something else, something older than fatigue. He looked up the moment Eli entered, expression unreadable. You planning to knock or just storm in like it's Fallujah again? Seth asked, voice low. Eli shut the door behind him. You ever gonna explain why a dog we both know damn well was retired 3 years ago is wearing a collar from Fort Gardner? From that unit? Seth's gaze dropped, but only for a second. I don't know. Bullshit. There was silence. The tension between them stretched like a fraying wire. We were promised those records were sealed, Eli pressed. That unit, what they did to the dogs their ranger, shouldn't have ended up in anyone's hands, not even yours. Seth turned away, looking out the window. You think I ordered him strung up on a bridge? I don't know what to think anymore, Eli said, softer now. But you're the only one who had access. And that number inside the collar, 407K, that was your assignment, I remember. Seth closed his eyes for a beat, shoulders rising with a long breath. You think I haven't been trying to forget that? What happened out there wasn't just a failed op. It was an experiment gone wrong, Those dogs, they were conditioned to ignore pain, suppress fear. You saw what it did to them. Eli's voice cracked. I saw what it did to us. The words sat between them like a bruise. Seth finally turned, meeting Eli's stare. I didn't bring Ranger back. I didn't even know he was Ranger, not until Claire called me last night. You knew the symbol, Seth nodded. But I didn't recognize the dog, not after all this time. Eli reached into his coat and tossed the collar onto the desk. It landed with a dull thud. I don't care who's responsible anymore, Eli said. I just want to know who's still out there pulling strings, because someone left him to die and they weren't finished. Seth's fingers brushed the collar. He looked haunted. I'll make some calls, he said. Do it fast. Back at the cabin, Sophie moved quietly through the back door, slipping on her coat and grabbing the small thermos of warm chicken broth she'd convinced Margaret, the neighbor, to help her make. The wind bit at her cheeks as she followed the trail down to the vet's barn behind the clinic. It was off hours, and Dr. Claire Mitchell had already agreed reluctantly to let Sophie have 5 minutes with Ranger as long as she stayed quiet and didn't startle him. Sophie was 8, curious, small for her age, but bright-eyed and endlessly tender-hearted. The kind of girl who buried earthworms back in the dirt after storms and named every deer she spotted from the car window. She had not spoken much since her mother died. But somehow, around Ranger, the words came. The barn was quiet, filled with the soft smells of hay and antiseptic. In one of the converted stalls, Ranger lay on a heated pad, an IV still taped to his foreleg. He didn't move much, but his ears perked when Sophie entered, and that alone made her heart skip. Hi, boy, she whispered, kneeling carefully beside him. She unscrewed the thermos cap and poured a little broth into a shallow bowl. Ranger sniffed. After a moment, he licked the edge. Sophie smiled. You're strong, Dad says so. And I think you remember things too, like how not all people are bad. Ranger blinked slowly, his body still, but his eyes never leaving hers. Sophie reached out and gently touched his fur. Sometimes, I think if I just talk enough, maybe someone who's gone can still hear me, like Mom. She sat cross-legged beside him, pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket. It was a drawing her and her dad standing in front of the cabin. Ranger was there too, his tail drawn too long, but happily so. You can keep this, she said, tucking it beside his bed. As she left, Ranger's paw shifted slightly toward the paper. Back in his truck, Eli stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror, watching the worry lines deepen around his eyes. Seth's words hadn't soothed anything. If anything, they confirmed that ghosts of the past weren't just memories now. They were back, active, and targeting what remained of the broken unit they once served in. As the engine hummed to life and frost clung to the windshield, Eli knew one thing. Ranger hadn't just survived. He'd come back for a reason. The wind picked up just after midnight, sweeping through Red Creek like a warning no one could understand, but everyone could feel. Atop the pine-covered hills, the old bridge, now cordoned off with orange tape and rusted signs, creaked against its own weight, swaying faintly in the dark. Snow, now icy and brittle, crusted over the paths that once led loggers and later hikers through the forest. And somewhere beneath that frozen silence, something shifted again. Eli Warren woke to the sound of Ranger retching. He bolted out of bed, still in his flannel shirt and worn jeans, feet hitting the hardwood before his mind had fully caught up. Down the short hallway and into the small corner room he'd converted into Ranger's recovery den, he found the dog on his side, trembling violently, saliva streaked with blood pooling beneath his muzzle. Jesus, Eli muttered, kneeling. Hang on. He wrapped Ranger in a blanket, cradling him like a fallen comrade, and carried him through the dark, out to the truck. The engine coughed once, then started, and the wheels tore through the frost-thinned driveway as he sped toward the clinic. Dr. Claire Mitchell was already awake when he arrived. She lived in the apartment above the veterinary barn, bare bones and practical, with unpainted pine walls, 2 framed black and white photos on the shelf, a younger brother in fatigues, a golden retriever now long gone, and a cot that hadn't seen more than 4 hours' use a night since she returned to Red Creek. She met Eli at the barn door, barefoot in sweatpants and a knit sweater, face pale, hair in a messy ponytail. Poison, she muttered an hour later, as she stood beside the table where Ranger lay unconscious, an IV running into his foreleg. Rodenticide fast-acting. He probably ingested it within the last few hours. But how? Eli asked, fists tight. Claire reached for a small plastic bag beside her. Inside it was the collar. "I found this in the snow outside the barn," she said, voice hollow. "Someone broke the latch on the window. They took it and left baited food." Eli stared at the empty bag, a fury slowly coiling in his gut. Someone wanted to finish what they started. Claire's gaze flicked up to meet his. "And they know where to strike." News spread fast in Red Creek. By morning, the town had fractured into whispers and narrowed eyes. At Baker's Mill Cafe, a rustic diner at the heart of Main Street, the regulars, farmers, ex-foresters, and a retired preacher huddled in tight groups over bitter coffee and overcooked eggs. "I heard it was someone from out of town," muttered Bill Cromer, a thick-set man in his 60s with a flannel shirt 2 sizes too small and hands stained from chainsaw oil. "You know, one of those corporate fellas sniffing around the timber rights." "Bull!" snapped Doreen Alcott, the postmaster's widow, tall and lean with sharp cheekbones and sharper opinions. "That dog's got history. This town's got history. Look close enough, you'll find your answer." And in hushed tones, "Some say Seth Foster's hiding something. Again." Eli stormed into the sheriff's office just before noon. Deputy Paul looked up, startled, but didn't stop him. Seth was reviewing surveillance footage from the clinic, mostly static and poor angles, but it captured someone in a heavy hooded coat ducking around the back barn window. The collar had been hanging on a hook, now gone. "You told me you'd handle this," Eli barked, his voice low but sharp. "You told me you'd make calls." "I did," Seth replied calmly. His eyes were darker today, tired. "And I found nothing. Because you're not looking in the right places." Seth leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "You think I did this? I think you let your guilt blind you to what's coming." "I didn't know Ranger was still on anyone's list." Eli crossed his arms. "Well, someone does, and they just tried to kill him. And you're sitting here watching footage instead of knocking on doors." The tension snapped like a pulled wire. Seth stood. "You think I don't want to make it right? That I don't go to sleep every night seeing 407K dragging broken limbs through a desert trench because I was the one who gave the command?" There it was. The confession neither of them had spoken out loud. Seth sat back down. "I'll find them, with or without you." That afternoon, Sophie returned from school, her face brighter than usual. Margaret had walked her home and dropped off a tin of fresh cornbread. But when she stepped inside the house and noticed the silence, no bark, no paw steps, her joy dimmed. "Dad," she called, dropping her backpack. Eli appeared from the kitchen, his voice tight but soft. "He's okay, but he got sick last night. Someone hurt him again." Sophie said nothing. She walked slowly to her room and closed the door. An hour later, when Eli went to check, the door was open and the back gate swinging. Sophie was gone. The first prints appeared about 50 yards into the woods, small boot prints leading toward the ridge trail, the same path that overlooked the old wooden bridge. Panic twisted through Eli's chest as he radioed the sheriff's department. Seth arrived first, breathless from the run, his coat already soaked with melting sleet. "She's headed for the bridge," Eli said, eyes wild. "Why?" Eli's voice cracked. "She thinks Ranger's in danger again, and she wants to help." Together they moved fast, flashlights bouncing off trees, boots slamming into brittle branches. The trail narrowed, then widened again as it reached the edge of the overlook. There, standing at the very start of the bridge, framed in the white static of falling snow, was Sophie, arms clutched around a box, eyes wide but determined. "Sophie," Eli called, voice full of fear and relief. She turned slowly. "I heard them. The people who hurt Ranger. I heard them in the woods. They said they'd come back." The box in her arms held a flashlight, a can of soup, and a tiny dog whistle. She was trying to lure them out. Eli's knees nearly buckled. Seth stepped forward. "We've got you," he said gently. "Let's get you somewhere warm." The morning sun had barely crested the ridge when Sheriff Seth Foster's voice cracked through every available radio in Red Creek. Missing child. Name: Sophie Warren. Age: 8. Last seen near Ridge Trail. All units respond. Within 30 minutes, nearly half the town had mobilized. Teachers, shopkeepers, ranchers, people who rarely spoke to one another outside of church pews or feed store aisles had come together, boots crunching through the frost-bitten forest, calling her name into the still air. Eli Warren stood at the base of the trail, fists clenched at his sides, jaw set like granite. Snow drifted around his boots. Seth approached from the east access road, bundled in his patrol jacket, breath fogging in the cold. His usual authority had given way to something more solemn, fear perhaps, or guilt. "You ready?" Seth asked, quieter than usual. Eli didn't answer with words. He simply nodded and started up the slope. They moved fast, flanked by volunteers. Tess McConnell, a middle-aged woman with thick auburn hair and hiking boots caked in slush, led the Northern Grid team. A mother of 4 and widow to a logger, she was as sturdy and practical as the thermos of coffee always tucked in her backpack. She gave a quick nod to Eli and Seth as they passed. Further down the ridge, Deputy Hal Kearns, a wiry man in his 50s with a bristled gray beard and a limp from a busted hip, was coordinating the radio network. Hal had never liked children much, but even he looked stricken as he barked out coordinates through a battered walkie-talkie. Time was ticking. Back in the town square, Claire Mitchell was prepping her van modified with animal transport equipment just in case. She didn't speak much that morning, only stared at the IV bag still half full in the clinic and wondered if she'd failed to guard something sacred. Meanwhile, in the woods, a set of small footprints led Seth and Eli directly to the frozen clearing near the broken bridge and something else. Dog tracks, fresh. "Ranger?" Seth whispered. "How the hell?" "He followed her," Eli said, his voice catching. Then a sound, a girl's cry, frantic, muffled. Eli ran. They broke through the trees and found the bridge. Sophie was crouched near the middle, holding onto a broken railing beam with one hand, the other gripping Ranger's collar. The dog's hind legs were planted on a beam behind her, while his front legs dangled, claws scraping wood. The rope beneath his vest had once again caught on something, but this time it was Sophie who kept him from slipping further. "Daddy!" Sophie screamed, her eyes wide and tear-lined. Ranger whimpered, exhausted. Eli's heart nearly exploded. He rushed to the edge, and then, click. The unmistakable sound of pressure releasing beneath his boot. A trap. He froze. Seth, just behind him, reacted instantly, grabbing Eli by the shoulder, yanking him back just in time before a net sprung from below the platform, snaring empty air. They both staggered. From the shadows at the far end of the bridge, a figure emerged. Greg Marlowe. Mid-50s, lean and jagged as rusted barbed wire, his eyes were 2 cold blue shards sunk deep into a sunburned face. He wore a tattered army coat, one boot duct-taped, and slung over his shoulder was a hunting rifle modified with makeshift parts. His beard was unkempt, gray streaks running through black like dead rivers. "Thought I'd find you here," he rasped. Eli stepped in front of Seth. "You were supposed to be in prison." Greg smiled faintly. "And you were supposed to be a brother. You tortured civilians. You made us lie in those reports. And when we didn't, you turned on us." Greg's smile vanished. "You think this is about justice? This is about being left behind." He raised the rifle, aiming at Ranger. Seth stepped out from behind Eli. "Greg, don't." Greg's hands shook slightly, not with fear, but fury. "You two ruined me. I had rank, power, and now I rot in a shack while you play town sheriff and school-run dad. You almost killed a child," Eli growled. Greg's finger twitched near the trigger. Sophie cried out again, "Please!" And then, without hesitation, Eli stepped out onto the bridge. The planks groaned. "Don't take another step," Greg warned. "Then shoot me," Eli said. "But you're not getting her." Behind him, Seth unclipped a taser from his belt, hidden by his coat. Greg shifted. Ranger barked sharp, defiant. And Seth fired. The taser hit Greg in the side. He spasmed, crumpled to the ground with a wheeze. Eli didn't wait. He ran forward, grabbing Sophie with one arm and Ranger with the other, hauling both back from the splintered edge. The bridge creaked, but held. Sophie sobbed into Eli's chest, her arms around Ranger, who nuzzled weakly against her. Seth stood over Greg's body, breathing hard. "He'll live," Claire said minutes later, arriving with the others. Eli nodded. "But he won't walk free again." Snow still blanketed Red Creek like a quilt pulled too tightly over a restless dream. A week had passed since the confrontation at the bridge, and though the danger had passed, the town still moved as though in recovery, slow, cautious, and occasionally staring over its shoulder. But beneath that cautious exterior, something had shifted. Whispers had softened, coffee shop glances were longer and kinder, and neighbors who once passed each other in silence now paused to ask, "How's Sophie doing?" or "Ranger still holding up?" Inside the Warren cabin, the fire burned low. The logs snapped gently, casting flickering shadows across the living room. Eli sat on the rug beside the hearth, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug of tea he didn't remember making. Across from him, curled under a fleece blanket, Sophie was fast asleep on the couch, her hand resting on Ranger's side. The dog stirred occasionally, still thin, still healing, but stronger than before. His breathing was steady now, his gaze alert even in rest. Eli glanced toward the window where dawn had begun to stain the snow outside with a dull orange hue. He hadn't spoken much since that day on the bridge. Not from trauma, but reflection, the kind of silence that only follows a decision that mattered. The door creaked open behind him. Seth stepped in, rubbing his gloved hands. His uniform jacket was zipped up high and his breath fogged the air behind him. He looked older somehow, though his eyes carried more clarity than guilt these days. "You too warm?" he asked. Eli nodded. She finally slept. Seth looked at the child, then the dog, then back to Eli. "You did good." Eli chuckled softly. "She did better." Seth pulled up a chair and sat near the fire. Feds came this morning, took Marlowe into custody officially. Turns out he'd been off-grid for years. Changed names 3 times, but someone was helping him. There's more to it, more files, more silence. Eli stared into the fire. "They'll bury it. Again." "Not if we don't let them." Eli turned slowly. "You think we still have that kind of power?" Seth looked at him with a quiet smile. "We never lost it. We just forgot." Behind them, Ranger stirred and sat up slowly, ears perking. His eyes locked on the door just as someone knocked twice. Claire Mitchell stepped inside, her parka covered in light snow. She looked more rested today, her posture looser, her smile natural. "I brought something," she said, kneeling beside Ranger and pulling a bundle from her coat. She unwrapped it gently, a newly crafted collar, dark leather, soft lining, no tracking chips. Just one hand-etched emblem, Sophie's drawing of a stick-figure ranger standing beside a stick-figure girl. "I had it made by Ethan Bell," she added, "retired saddle maker. You know, the one who only takes work when it's meaningful." Said this was the first time in a decade he didn't hesitate. Sophie stirred, blinking sleepily. "Is that for Ranger?" Claire smiled and handed it to her. "Only if he says yes." Sophie stood, wobbled a little from fatigue, then knelt beside Ranger. "Hey, buddy, want to wear something that means you're home?" The shepherd nuzzled her hand. Ranger wore the new collar that day. Later that afternoon, the 3 of them stood near the bridge once more, not out of fear, but ceremony. The town had quietly decided the old Red Creek Bridge would be dismantled come spring. Too many memories. Too many ghosts. But before that, they came. Neighbors, friends, people who'd once stood on opposite sides of conversations and fences. They stood together now. At the head of the gathering, Mayor Delilah Ames, a tall, silver-haired woman with a booming voice and a wardrobe full of thick wool coats, stood beside the old beam and addressed the crowd. Red Creek has always been the kind of place that forgets how strong it really is, but sometimes it takes a child, a dog, and 2 men who stop speaking to remind us. Seth and Eli stood side by side. No badge, no uniform between them. Just history and something beginning to resemble forgiveness. In the following weeks, life trickled back to normal. The snow began to recede. Sophie returned to school, carrying Ranger's photo in her lunchbox. Eli reopened his small carpentry workshop and found, to his surprise, a waiting list of neighbors needing help. Seth filed his final report on the Marlowe case and received a quiet letter of thanks from Washington he would never mention aloud. One day, as spring officially broke through winter's hold, Sophie stood in the field behind the house, throwing a rubber ring. Ranger chased after it, stumbling a little at first, then running fully by the 3rd toss. "You're back," she yelled, laughing. He barked once, joyous, and returned the ring. Eli watched from the porch, hand resting on the new collar he'd polished the night before. And behind them, for the first time in a long time, the world felt light. Sometimes the bridges we fear most are the ones that lead us back to ourselves, in a world that often forgets how to forgive. This story reminds us of the quiet strength found in trust, the healing power of second chances, and the love that lives between a child, a father, and a dog who never gave up. You don't have to be a hero to save someone. You just have to show up again and again with your heart open. If this story touched you, please consider sharing it with someone who needs a little hope today. Drop a comment below. Tell us what part moved you most. And if you believe in the power of loyalty, healing, and God's grace, type Amen in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that might just change your day or your heart. May God bless you and keep you safe, always.